and welcome to the Wormhole Podcast, episode 27. I'm Charlie Place, and joining me today is a debut novelist of a wonderfully written novel set in the 1840s, the slavery and Irish potato famine eras. It was published last month. Hello, Tammye Huf.
Hi, Charlie.
How are you?
I'm doing really well, thanks. Doing very well. Despite the crazy situation at the moment, it's been actually a few exciting weeks for me.
Well, how is it publishing a debut in a pandemic?
Different, I gather, in that I don't have that sort of comparison to know this is how it normally is. From what I gather, it's been quite different. All of the normal readings that you would have and the signings that you would have all fallen by the wayside. And so the entire launch has been online.
Mm-hmm. You have had a nice Radio 2 interview, though, which was yesterday in terms of our recording and about 3 weeks ago in terms of when this podcast goes out.
Yes, exactly. That was last night. That was very exciting. And again, normally you would go into the studio, but in the pandemic, that wasn't the case. I called in from home and we did everything remotely. But hopefully it sounded as normal as it would have sounded if I had actually been in the studio.
Well, I can confirm, listeners, it did sound good. It was a good interview, and there should be about 7 more days left for you to listen to it. If you haven't already, I'll drop the link in the description. So, we'll go to your book. A More Perfect Union sees 1840s Irishman Henry emigrate to America for a better life. It also sees newly sold Sarah as a house slave at a hopefully better than her last plantation. And whilst Henry is travelling around the south for his job and Sarah is walking outside her plantation, the two meet and sparks fly. We'll leave it there for the summary. Tammye, tell us about your great-great-grandparents. This is relevant, listeners.
So my great-great-grandfather came from Ireland, immigrated to the United States, and met my great-great-grandmother, who was a slave. And when they met and fell in love, obviously it was not an easy thing, but he did wind up buying her freedom to marry her. The premise of this story actually is based on their story.
So you say the premise. How much of the story then is completely fictional in regards to your grandparents?
The details are fictional. The interesting thing about family legends that are sort of passed down, you don't generally talk about the specific ins and outs and details of exactly what happened, when, where, that sort of thing. So the broad strokes is what gets passed down, especially that long ago. So the broad strokes is what I have. So all of the details, well, some of the details are actually real, but that's not entirely true. Wherever I had real details, like for instance, he really was a blacksmith, this great-great-grandfather of mine. So that is in the story. He really did come from County Cork. So that is in the story. But how he came to be a blacksmith, that I don't know. And so I've invented that. Or how exactly my great-great-grandparents met, that I don't know. And so that I've invented.
That's fascinating. What made you want to tell this story, kind of to start with your grandparents and take it further?
Well, I didn't grow up hearing the story. I heard the story when I was an adult. And when I heard the story, it just resonated with me so much. I was already married, and as it happens, I am in an interracial marriage. And I know, even in now, our modern day, there are some moments where you encounter people who might not find that a good idea. And so if you think back to the middle of the 19th century and you imagine how hard they would have had it, not just from the consciousness of society, but also from a legality perspective, because it was actually illegal for them. And that story just really sat with me, and their determination and really how much they must have loved each other to go through all of this just to be together. The story wouldn't let me go. It stayed kicking around in my brain, and I felt like I had to write about them.
Mm-hmm. And you have a reading from Henry's point of view for us.
I do. I'll just set the scene just a little bit. So Sarah and Henry have already met at this point, and they have already started to realize that they like each other quite a bit. And then she's come to see him. And then when I get back to Sarah, she's looking over my work from the morning, the neck rings and the wrist chains. You made these? The tone in her voice makes me want to say no, which would be a lie. Instead, I point to the neck rings and say, those ones I only fixed. She doesn't say a word, just stares at them. Mr. Johnson hired me to do a job, I say carefully. I can see the way she's looking at them, at what they must mean to her. I hate that I have them here. I hate that I made them, but what can I do? You know what they are? I do. I take a step towards her and she backs up, bumping into the anvil. Sarah, I don't agree with the use of them. But you made them, she says. They pay me to make things. She shakes her head with a look in her eye, like I'm not who she thought I was. This is how I live, I say. I have to feed and clothe myself. I take the work I can get, and how I feel about what I make doesn't matter. What matters is getting paid. She shakes her head at me. You're a free man. You take whatever jobs you want. You can say no. I clasp her arm, needing her to understand, but she cringes away from me like I might hit her, and I know I've made a mistake by grabbing her. I force myself to let her go and walk up to the workbench, picking up a neck ring. I don't agree with this, I say, but I can see something has shifted for her. She stares at the ring and places a hand to her throat. You ever have one of those around your neck? I can't answer her. I can't look at her. She snatches up the shackles and thrusts them into my chest. Or one of these around your ankles? I lay my hand over hers and she pulls it away, leaving me holding the cold iron. I feel the shame choking me, but also the anger, because she doesn't understand what I've been through or why I need to keep working no matter what. I've had shackles my whole life, I tell her. Being poor is like a chain that squeezes tighter every time your empty belly rumbles, and I'll not be its victim again. It's like a chain, she says, like the ones that cut your skin, making your ankles bleed when they march you down to the auction block. Does it feel like that? Or like being hooked to the man in front of you and the woman behind you, keeping you hunched up, taking half steps all the way from Charlottesville? You don't understand. And when a man down the line takes up a rock and hits at your poor man chains, does he get whipped till he can't hardly stand? So everybody knows never to try to touch them chains again? You've never known what it means to starve, to see your family shrink to skeletons and die of hunger. She lays her hand over the links of metal on the table, like she's checking that they're real. And I can see she's trembling. She doesn't look at me as she says, I know about dying of other things.
What you've just read is a good way of me starting to this question. You've got this very romantic aspect to the book, and that's obviously quite different in terms of place, the era, but it's interesting because as the reader, you're getting used to reading about nice things, and then you've got an awful scene about slavery. You know, I mean, the bit that you've read just there is an idea of it, but then it does get worse. And these scenes are actually made more apparent in their awfulness by the fact of the romance being there. How important was balancing the romance with the history?
Yeah, I thought that was vital because it's a story of these two people who are falling in love. And for the purpose of the story, they've got to really be in love in order for this to work. But at the same time, it is set where it is set, and their lives would have been what they are. And so it was important not to get too carried away with the romance, because this other bit weighs you down. It is a real thing that would be dragging back their relationship and just the quality of their lives.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm guessing you looked at primary sources during your research. Which ones did you use, if there were any specific ones you can highlight?
Yeah, I read quite a lot. First, doing the Ireland bit, I read a lot of firsthand accounts of the famine and a lot of governmental policies, because I have to admit, going into this, I knew, of course, the Irish famine, and it was horrible and lots of people died and so forth and immigrated, but I didn't actually know the extent of it. I just didn't know how bad it actually was. And so that was really fascinating for me to see exactly how bad and how widespread and how long it lasted and how avoidable it was as well. I mean, that was the other shocking thing. It's just, history is full of disappointments where people just do the wrong thing all the time and at the expense of other people. And the Irish famine is full of instances of that. So that reading firsthand accounts was very important to me so that I could get as close to a feel of what it was like there at the time as possible. And then similarly, reading firsthand accounts of slavery. And by that, I mean slave narratives. There are quite a few slave narratives out there, mostly written by men, but there actually are some written by women as well. That was very valuable for me to read. There are also slave recordings, which are hugely valuable. In the United States, around the turn of the century, there was this project where people went and did folk recordings of just people out scattered about the countryside. And as it turns out, they wound up getting a lot of recordings of people who had been in their childhood and in their teenage years slaves, and who reminisced about that time and spoke from firsthand experience. They were lost for a very long time because of quality of reporting, but they were recently digitally remastered, so we actually have them again. So they were actually really fascinating to listen to, because you're listening to the actual voices of these people and the way they talk about it and their cadence of speech. All of it was hugely, hugely helpful. And then also just researching the times. So government policies is very important to understand the psyche of a people. To know, for instance, that it was illegal for Henry and Sarah to marry at that time, to know the sort of consequences, to know that people were arrested for helping slaves. And you get a sense of the values of society when you read about the laws of a society. So that was also very important.
Mm-hmm. Well, you say that you didn't have so much information about your great-great-grandparents. Although you may not be able to get these extra facts of going forward, do you feel closer to them?
I do, because I've spent so much time understanding their world. And even if I don't know exactly, every step that they took, I know that they took steps sort of like these, and these would have been their types of options. And so, yeah, I do definitely feel closer to them, because I feel as if I know their world so much more intimately than I did.
Mm-hmm. Well, you have talked about the research, and that's really interesting to know. I mean, about the recordings in particular, I'm going to have to see if I can track those down, because that is fascinating.
Actually, you can. I'll just tell you, they're at the Library of Congress, and you can access them through the Library of Congress, free for everyone.
Fantastic. Listeners, I will put a link in there for you. So, on this note, how did you go about creating Sarah from your facts and your research? We know about Henry a bit, but Sarah.
Yeah, Sarah was harder because I suppose it's just a byproduct of the sort of world that we've lived in. The stories that trickled down in my family about Henry were more than the stories that trickled down about her. I knew more of his personality and his temperament through other family stories that had nothing to do with this time, that had something to do with, things that happened later that my mother or grandmother would say about this person. But as far as Sarah, there was really very little family information that trickled down. So getting to know her was actually harder. And for that, I used, I suppose, more of a generic approach of, okay, slavery of the time. And for a woman being a slave at the time, you had particular difficulties and issues. And so I tapped into that. Also, as I said, these slave narratives written specifically by women were very, very helpful. And so much reading. And then just trying to place myself into that skin, into that time. And what would that be like? And what would that feel like?
Mm-hmm. Will you have another reading from Sarah's point of view for us?
I do. So this one takes place fairly earlier on. And this is actually an interaction without Henry. This is an interaction with another slave called Maple, who is actually the third point of view character. The story is written through the point of view of Sarah and Henry, but also through the point of view of a third character called Maple. She features in this particular reading. Maple motions me over with a flick of her finger and leads me inside. The entrance is long and wide, with paintings hung all along the walls. When I follow her to the stairway, one of the dark wood floorboards squeaks under my foot. The woman glares back at me. Sorry, ma'am, I say, and I hop quick off the noisy board. She pinches her lips and raises her eyebrows. I can see the nastiness and the hardness in her, and I hope she ain't fixing to aim it at me. Miss Martha wants you sleeping on the floor in Master Thomas's room, she says. He's been waking up the whole house with his night frights, and it's going to be your job to keep him quiet. In the morning, you come on down and find me in the kitchen house, and I'll get you to work helping with breakfast and give you your chores for the day. I blink at her, piecing together the meaning behind her words. She said, Miss Martha and Master Thomas, not your Mrs. and your young master. She said, in the morning, I'll find her in the kitchen house making breakfast. Here I am thinking she's a cousin or a spinster aunt, but she's a slave. I swallow the yes ma'am sitting ready on my tongue and instead ask, what's wrong with Master Thomas? Thrown from a horse, she says. Don't know why anyone would put a 6-year-old boy on a horse in the first place, but they did, and now he screams the house down almost every night thinking about it. What's Miss Martha want me to do with him? Get him back to sleep, and you'll be calling her Mrs. It's Master and Mrs. here. I call her Miss Martha because I've been calling her that since she was little. I look again at her high forehead and small, close-set eyes. She grew up with you? She nods. I was 12 when she was born. I've been taking care of her all her life. Couldn't do without me when she got married, so her daddy gave me as a wedding gift. She spits out the word daddy in a puff of bitterness, and I know why she looks like the missus, and I know why she looks so angry. Their daddy gave his older daughter to his white daughter as her slave. Maple must have come from a long line of slave mothers and slave owner fathers to wind up so light she could pass for white. Looking like she does, it would be so much easier to run. I wonder if she's tried. I guess they don't got the railroad up here, I say, trying to ask without asking. It's not enough to know about the Underground Railroad helping runaway slaves. You've got to find them, too. Maple squints at me with her daddy's eyes and purses her mama's lips tight. You best get that thought right out of your head before someone comes along and beats it out. Everything you do gets paid for one way or the other. If you ain't the one paying, you can bet someone else is.
Why did you include Maple, and who is she? Why is she there in your story itself?
So the main story, of course, is Henry and Sarah, and it is this love story. And you see this very unlikely relationship unfold for that time of this white man and this black woman who's also a slave. And Maple is a sort of a counterweight to their love story. Maple is more of the common experience of what other people would have experienced at that time, because their experience wasn't the norm. And Maple's experience is much more the norm. And so she gives voice to another picture, another side of slavery life for a woman. And it's quite a different picture than Sarah's experience.
Mm-hmm. And excuse the term, everybody, but Maple is, I believe, a quadroon.
Yeah, actually, she's an octoroon, which is another kind of weird thing. Back then, it really mattered so much how much, and if you were even just a little bit black, you were black. Whether you looked white or not, you were black. And so they had terms for this, so that if you had one white parent and one black parent, then you were only a mulatto. And then if that mulatto child had a child with somebody who was white, that child would be a quadroon, as you say. And if that quadroon child had a child with someone who was white, then that child would be an octoroon, and so on it goes. I mean, if you think about it, it's really quite strange and bizarre that they had names for this. It was so common that they actually had names for this. But all of those people, as long as the mother had been a slave, all of those people, no matter what they came out looking like, would also be slaves.
Mm-hmm. What you did with it was interesting. How it all fits together with the plantation. Let's leave it there to try not to spoil too much of the book. It was interesting. It was very well done.
For me, she's just quite an interesting character too, because of her relationship, this sort of bizarre relationship that she has to her owners. I'm sort of putting air quotes around owners, but they're her owners, and also her family. And what's come out in the passage that I just read, that her half sister is also her mistress, her owner. And so it creates just this bizarre dynamic of belonging and not belonging, and horrible resentments of, this is my life, but only because of this Black ancestor that I have that's different to you. And it just creates a very strange dynamic. And with Maple as a point of view character, I had the opportunity to bring that very strange aspect of slavery also into the book.
Well, I like how, again, try not to spoil the book, how you finish the thread with Maple is very interesting, because you've still got questions that the reader's got to go away with and think about. So what is behind this, I suppose, nicer as they go owner, who's got this, to our mind, bizarre and, of course, racist attitude with Christianity involved? Did you always plan to have this owner?
Yes, definitely. It was very, very important to me that the owner, the master, be this sort of, if you can use this word together with the word master, nice master. I grew up understanding, of course, that slavery is bad. For me, that was, that's a clear thing. Slavery is bad. And at some point, I encountered the idea that there are some people who believed or took the view that slavery was bad if you had a bad and evil, mean, cruel master. But if you had a very kind and generous and good master, then slavery was perhaps not so bad. I think of it as a kind of a gone with the wind idea of slavery, where everybody wears nice clothes and everybody seems so happy. And surely it wasn't really that bad, because you had, clothes and food and that sort of thing. And so it was very important to me that the master be one of these good slave masters, and to show that even in that situation, you are a slave, and to kind of debunk the idea that it is possible to have a good master.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Where you've got the element of Christianity, which is of course very, very real there, it happens all the time, but I think you've got a particular level of dedication to using the Christianity in there that really brings home the, I'm calling it bizarre, of course that's a nice way of putting it, I suppose, the attitude towards the Christianity.
Yeah.
In particular, that obviously with Christianity, and that's through the years we can relate to that, the Christianity itself, and it really does give you an idea for how things were.
Yeah, I think, unfortunately, Christianity has been used as a weapon against people so often throughout history. And I think this is one of those times where you can take stuff that's in the Bible and bend it to your will and make it say almost anything. And that is actually what did happen at that time. Slave masters and pastors and the church in the US, in the South at least, they did use Christianity against the slaves to make them think that this is your lot in life. This is your God-given place in the world, and you ought not hope or want more. It's shocking to think about, but it was actually done.
Mm-hmm. Obviously, yes, it beggars belief, doesn't it? It's yeah. There's a slave in the book who is offered their freedom. I'm not going to say the names or anything like that, but they ask to remain at the plantation because their family's there, their life's been there, and then the owner completely misunderstands the situation, whether intentionally or not. Were there many people in history in that situation of saying no to leaving, being free in that way, and being used as a puppet, effectively?
There were a lot of laws against allowing people to free slaves. So, as in the book, the master isn't actually allowed to just free the slave until he goes to the courthouse and does what he needs to do. And actually part of that, which I don't get into in the book because it's then, an extraneous tangent, is you needed a reason. You need to say this slave is being freed for faithful service, and this slave is being freed because, he saved my life or something. Weirdly enough, there had to be a reason, even if you were owning the slave and wanted to free him or her. And so because of that, you actually didn't have many slaves being freed. And there was a huge social pressure not to free slaves, because then that gets among the other slave owners, because they didn't want all of these free people giving their slaves ideas that maybe they could be freed too. So it didn't happen very often that slaves were just freed. It did happen, but not as often. What happened more often was that you would buy your freedom. if you were a kind master, you might give your slave permission. That's touched on a little bit in the book, to spend their Sundays off. Often they had a Sunday, where they didn't have to work there, or in the evenings when they're finished with their daily task, to work for somebody else doing something else, making something or cleaning something, whatever, and earn money that way. And so some slaves were able to, over many, many years of work and squirreling away money, some slaves were able to buy their freedom. But as far as setting people free, that was less done. Also, there was a law that was passed that if a slave was too old, it was difficult then to free a slave. But you could certainly be just under that age and not really able to help yourself in the world, and find it difficult.
Well, I think something you said earlier there about the pyramid almost of the owners having someone else's rules to listen to is maybe something that isn't so well known. So that was interesting to hear.
Yeah, which is part of why it made it very difficult to be an abolitionist in the South in that time. Even if you were a white person, a white man, which was kind of the top of the food chain then, but if you were espousing abolitionist thoughts and passing out abolitionist literature, you could be arrested in some places. There was a lot of not only social pressure, but also laws in place to prop up the institution of slavery.
Mm-hmm. I've got a particular question. Can we talk about Henry? To me, he comes across as quite careless sometimes. Yeah, in the way that he thinks that he can meet up with Sarah when she's on the plantation in various different places. And Sarah often tells him, you can't do this because, it's dangerous.
Yeah.
And obviously, he doesn't have the context that we have today. Obviously, he's come from Ireland. He's quite possibly never seen a black person before. Certainly would have never encountered slavery and things like that. I did find it quite interesting. I was kind of like, oh, Henry, stop. You need to stop. This is dangerous. Yeah. Did you ever consider a different bearing for him?
I did, although I did get that bearing from some of the stories that came down about the actual Henry, the great-great-grandfather Henry. He was a sort of a act first, think later kind of a person, it seems, from some of the stories that came down. He's a very emotional, responding person. And so I did want to include some of that into my character Henry. Because that, again, at any time that I knew anything about these people, I did try to incorporate it. So that is part of his actual personality, this kind of reactionary personality, rather than sitting back and thinking and analyzing the situation. But I did consider how to balance that it was important that he comes to a point where he starts to realize and see. And as you say, he's coming from Ireland. He doesn't really know what he's walking into most of the time. He comes from Ireland to New York first, and he does not expect that there is all of this anti-Irish prejudices in New York. It's supposed to be this great land of opportunity, and he comes there and there are all these signs everywhere. No Irish need apply, and nobody wants the Irish anywhere, and it's very difficult for him, and he wasn't expecting that. And as he goes on through the story, he's not a worldly guy, and he is a little bit naive in some ways. He gets himself into situations where after the fact he thinks, oh, I should have handled this situation differently, and then I wouldn't be in this position. I won't go into the detail of that, but that happens also fairly early on in New York. And so he is very much an act first sort of a person, which is what drives a lot of his, as well as you say, carelessness. I mean, it is a kind of a carelessness to not think through something before you do something. But that is much of who he was in real life, and that's why he was that way.
Well, that's fascinating. Yeah. It's interesting in the way that it has a bearing on the story, because it makes the reader, I think, more drawn in, because, of course, what can happen.
Yes. I think also with the idea of the carelessness, I think in that situation, I think quite honestly, if somebody wasn't a bit careless, it never would have happened, because it is a kind of a careless relationship to enter into. And I think somebody has to, if somebody wasn't there throwing caution to the wind and doing something that's really just crazy, just really, why would you even pursue this? In any rational thinking person's mind, if you think this through at all, you would quickly realize that this is going to be a rough road, and do I want to even start down this road? You wouldn't get very far down that road if you did first think about it.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned where Henry's from. He's come into this country where he's not allowed to go places, Irish out and all that kind of thing. But there is something within the Potato Famine. You have this element called tumbling.
Yeah.
Would you be able to give us a kind of an overview of that?
Yeah, that was one of the things that I didn't know about until I started researching, and I thought, how absolutely cruel. Basically, when the famine hit and people were starving to death, they were also not able to pay their rent, and they were in a bad way. And rather than extending credit or, showing mercy, the landowners wanted basically to clear the land of these tenant farmers. It came to a point that everything was parceled so small that actually it would have been, for many landowners, more profitable to just put it all to grazing, to get rid of the Irish, to get rid of the people, and to have animals graze the land and be done with it. And so they quickly took the opportunity to get rid of the tenants whenever they couldn't pay. Whenever the tenants could not pay their rent, they had their houses destroyed, and they called it tumbling, because the houses would tumble in stone on stone until you had this pile of what used to be a house. And it would be homes that people had lived in their whole lives, homes that people had spent generations in. Your parents and your grandparents had all lived in this home, and it's just gone, which was entirely legal. They didn't pay their rent, and they have to leave the land, and they would tumble the houses and kick them off the land.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I know. I heard about the Potato Famine, but that was something that was quite shocking early on in the book.
Yeah, it was very heartless, extremely heartless, but it was a reality, and so many people did lose their homes that way.
Mm-hmm. If you don't mind me asking this question, if it's not too much of a spoiler, do you think Red ever found his freedom?
Yes. Yes, I do. I'm a hopeful person. I'm generally quite an optimistic person. And while I'm not deluded enough to think of a happy ending for everybody in the book, I think that Red was so motivated to find his freedom, and presented with even a little bit of an opportunity to do so, that he would do so. So yes, I do believe that in my mind, one day, Red is free.
Good. Yay. I think in this book, obviously, all the hope that there is you cling on to it.
Yes. Yeah. In a situation where there is so little hope, that when you do have opportunities of hope, yes, absolutely, you grab hold with both hands.
Mm-hmm. So I've got what's going to seem a jarring question, but it's the question that I end the podcast with. What's next? I know the book is only just released, but...
Yeah, exactly. I do have a next, but yeah, as you say, this one is just released, and I'm sort of getting my head into that one slowly and plotting it out. And I won't talk about it too much, because it's still kind of too early days to get into it too much. But I thought about coming into the modern age, because it was a lot of work doing all of the historical research. I will have to say, this book has been researched very, very deeply, and everything in there is, well, I was going to say is historically accurate as possible, but no, everything in there is historically accurate. And so for that, there was a lot of research went into that. So I was going to give myself a break and do something modern, but my interest, unfortunately, is still back in the past. I think the next book is going to be also a historical fiction piece, and I'm actually really quite interested in family legacy at the moment, and my family has lived some fascinating lives, and I think the next bit that I write is going to have to do with my grandmother and her brother, who had an incredible experience.
Well, yeah, I mean, if you do go down that path, that's very interesting. That would be interesting to see more of your family. I completely understand you want to do modern, but historical fiction is definitely something that works for you, I think, definitely.
Hopefully pays off in the end. That's the idea.
Yeah, definitely. So, listeners, A More Perfect Union is out now from Myriad Editions, and links to purchase it are in the episode description. If you have enjoyed this conversation, do subscribe to the podcast for future episodes, and as always, if you'd like to contact the show, the email address is in the description. Tammye, as said a minute ago, this has been fascinating having you here, frankly. It's been great. Thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed this. I do enjoy having spent so long with my nose in the work and in this book. It's actually such a joy to talk to people about it and be able to converse about these characters that have been living in my head for so long. So thank you so much for having me on.
Join me on Monday the 14th of December when I will be talking to Deborah Swift, author of many books set in the 1600s, including The Lady's Slipper, The Gilded Lily, and A Divided Inheritance, and also 3 books set in the Second World War. It's these 3 we'll be covering. They are Past Encounters, The Occupation, and the forthcoming The Lifeline. The Wormhole Podcast, episode 27, was recorded on the 3rd of November and published on the 23rd of November 2020. Music and production by Charlie Place.